before the first city was built, before the first song was sung, before any human hand had ever pressed its shape into wet clay and left it there to dry. There was fire, not fire as we hold it now, tamed in lanterns and coaxed from steel, but fire as the gods alone possessed it, wild, unreachable, a light that lived only on Olympus, far above the cold and dark where men huddled together and waited for morning. It was a titan who changed that, and it was a titan who paid for it, endlessly, terribly, and alone. His name was Prometheus. In the ancient Greek tongue, the word means forethought, the one who thinks before he acts, and in a world ruled by gods who acted on whim and passion, that single quality made him the most dangerous being alive. He could see forward through time the way a hawk sees down through distance, clearly, calmly, and without flinching at what lay ahead. Prometheus was born of the Titans, the vast and primordial race of divine beings who ruled the cosmos before the Olympians ever rose to challenge them. His father was Iapetus, one of the original 12 Titans, born from Ouranos, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. His mother, in many tellings, was the Oceanid Clymene, a daughter of the great encircling ocean. From this lineage, Prometheus inherited something more than power. He inherited antiquity itself. He was old in a way that even the gods of Olympus were not, carrying within him the memory of a world before Zeus had drawn his first breath. He was also, remarkably, on the winning side of history, at least at first. Unlike most of his Titan kin, Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus did not fight for Kronos in the great war between the Titans and the Olympians. That catastrophic conflict the Greeks called the Titanomachy. Prometheus, with his gift of foresight, had seen which way the war would turn. He counseled his brothers to side with Zeus, and so when the dust of that 10-year war finally settled and the Titans were hurled into Tartarus, Prometheus walked free. He stood in the sunlight of the new world, an ally of the victorious gods, trusted, respected, and welcomed into the courts of Olympus. It should have been enough. For most beings, divine or mortal, it would have been. But Prometheus had also looked down from those luminous halls, down past the slopes of Olympus, into the valleys and the plains where a new creation wandered, humanity. Young, fumbling, extraordinary in potential, and utterly without protection. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Some ancient sources, most notably Ovid, credit Prometheus himself with shaping the first human beings from river clay, breathing into them the quality of divine reason, modeling their faces upward toward the stars rather than downward toward the earth like the beasts. Whether sculptor or simply champion, his bond with this fragile new species was absolute. He loved them, not with the remote, conditional love of a god amused by his creations, but with the fierce, active love of a parent watching a child stand for the first time. And so the collision between Prometheus and the divine order became inevitable. His power was not merely his foresight, though that alone would have made him formidable. He possessed vast creative intelligence, a cunning that outpaced the gods themselves. He was said to have taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, navigation, mathematics, writing, medicine. He was the great benefactor, the bridge between the divine world and the human one. And his domain, in the oldest symbolic readings of the myth, was this act of transmission itself, the passing of sacred knowledge from one realm to another, the dangerous and beautiful work of illumination. Against all of that, Zeus placed a single prohibition: fire, the tool that would allow humans to cook, to forge metal, to warm themselves against the night, to build everything that civilization is built upon, would remain the property of the gods. It was not cruelty exactly, it was order, a boundary between the human and the divine, a line that kept the cosmos arranged as Zeus intended. Prometheus looked at that line. He looked at the shivering, struggling people below. He looked at the fire burning bright on Olympus. And he walked across the line anyway. What followed was not merely a theft. It was the hinge upon which all of Western mythology turns. A story about defiance and suffering, about the cost of love, and about whether the act of giving something beautiful to the world is worth an eternity of pain. It is a story that has never stopped being told, because it has never stopped being true. Settle in. We are only just beginning. There is a particular kind of darkness that has no name in any modern language, because no living person has ever truly stood inside it. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where shapes still gather themselves from memory, and the glow beneath a door reminds you that the world continues. Not the darkness of a forest at midnight, where stars still press through the canopy and the moon hangs somewhere, patient and silver above the trees. This was older darkness, deeper, the kind that preceded every flame humanity has ever kindled. Every torch, every hearth, every lamp held aloft at the end of a long corridor. Before Prometheus crossed that line, this was the darkness in which human beings were born, lived out their brief and brutal years, and died. To understand why Prometheus did what he did, you have to sit with that darkness for a moment. You have to feel the weight of it. The Greeks imagined the earliest age of human existence through several lenses, and none of them were gentle. Hesiod, the great poet who gave us our most complete account of the Prometheus myth, described the history of humanity as a descent through ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and finally iron. Each one more difficult and more fallen than the last. But even before that decline, before the ages had names at all, the humans Prometheus watched were living at something close to the level of animals. They had reason, yes. That quality Prometheus himself had either breathed into them or simply recognized as their defining gift. They could think, they could speak, they could look at the sky and wonder what it was. But wonder without tools is a beautiful and useless thing. It lights nothing, it warms nothing, it builds nothing you can put your hands on. They ate raw what the earth offered them, roots pulled from the cold ground, berries stripped from thorned branches, meat, when they could catch it, consumed as other predators consumed it, without fire, without transformation. And here is something worth pausing on, because it is not simply a matter of comfort. Cooking is not a luxury. The application of heat to food kills parasites, breaks down toxins, softens tough fibers into something the human gut can actually extract nutrition from. Anthropologists and biologists today argue that cooking may have been the very mechanism that allowed the human brain to grow as large as it did. That without the caloric efficiency of cooked food, the extraordinary metabolic demands of our intelligence could never have been met. Fire, in other words, was not just warmth. It was the physical precondition of the mind itself becoming what it was capable of becoming. Prometheus, with his foresight, may have understood this in a way that Zeus did not, or would not. The nights were the worst of it. Human beings, unlike most of the creatures that share the earth with them, are almost entirely defenseless in the dark. Our eyes do not gather light the way a cat's do. We do not have the hearing of an owl or the nose of a wolf. When the sun went down in that fireless world, the darkness was not merely inconvenient, it was lethal. Predators moved through it freely. Temperatures dropped in ways that exposed skin and thin animal hide could not always survive. The sick died faster. The young and the old died first. There was no surgery by lamplight, no reading by candlelight, no conversation held warm beside a glowing hearth. There was only the animal urgency of surviving until the sun came back, and Prometheus watched all of this. That is the detail that the myth returns to, quietly and persistently, in its oldest forms. He watched. He looked down from Olympus, where the divine fire burned as it had always burned, plentiful, eternal, taken entirely for granted by those who held it. And he looked at the people below, and he kept looking until looking was no longer something he could justify doing. There is a version of divinity that is defined by distance. Many of the Olympian gods maintained it brilliantly. They observed humanity the way a wealthy patron might observe the suffering outside his window, with a mixture of pity, entertainment, and the comfortable certainty that the arrangement was fundamentally correct. Zeus himself operated largely from this position. Humans were below, gods were above. The line between them existed for reasons, and the reasons were valid, and that was the end of the discussion. Order is order. Hierarchy is hierarchy. The cosmos does not apologize for being arranged as it is. Prometheus could not settle into that view, whether it was his nature, his foresight, or the particular bond he had formed with humanity in that foundational act of creation. He had crossed some interior threshold long before he ever crossed the physical one on Olympus. The suffering was not abstract to him. It was specific and daily, and it had a solution sitting right there, burning on the mountaintop, belonging to beings who had more of it than they would ever need. It is worth considering, too, what the gods actually feared about giving fire to human beings, because the prohibition Zeus placed on humanity was not arbitrary, and it was not simply cruelty dressed up as policy. Fire, in the ancient symbolic imagination, was power itself. It was the capacity to transform. A world in which humans possessed fire was a world in which humans could forge bronze and then iron. They could clear forests. They could build walls. They could cook, not just food, but the entire concept of civilization. The city, the ship, the forge, the temple. Zeus was not wrong to understand that fire would change the equation between gods and men in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to reverse. Once given, it could not be taken back. Once humanity stepped across that threshold, the gap between human and divine would begin, slowly but irreversibly, to narrow. That was precisely the point, from Prometheus's perspective, and that was precisely the problem, from Zeus's. The method Prometheus chose has its own quiet poetry. He did not steal fire, the way a thief snatches gold, frantically, in the dark, hoping not to be seen. He took a hollow fennel stalk, narthex the Greeks called it, a plant whose pithy interior could hold a coal for hours without burning through, and he walked to where the fire of the gods burned, and he held that stalk to the flame, and he carried it back down the mountain to the world below. The image is almost impossibly tender for an act of cosmic defiance. A hollow reed, a single ember, a titan walking carefully so the flame would not go out. When the fire arrived among humanity, the change was not slow. That is what the myth insists upon, and that is what the archaeological and anthropological record, in its own way, corroborates. Fire reorganizes everything it touches. The first hearth does not just warm one family. It becomes the center of community, the place around which stories are told and tools are made and children are kept safe through the night. It extends the day by hours, creating time that did not exist before, time in which the human mind can do something other than simply survive. Pottery becomes possible. Metallurgy becomes possible. Medicine, in its earliest forms, becomes possible. The reed that Prometheus carried down the mountain was not just carrying fire. It was carrying the entire future of human civilization inside its fragile, hollow length. Prometheus knew this. He had seen it. His foresight had shown him exactly what that single ember would become, traveling forward through centuries like a river finding the sea. He knew, too, what was coming for him the moment Zeus looked down and saw the lights appearing across the darkened human world. those small, scattered points of brilliance beginning to multiply in the valleys and along the riverbeds like stars falling to earth. He knew, and he carried the stalk carefully anyway, sheltering the flame with his hand against the wind. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive armored, with a weapon drawn and an army at its back. It arrives alone, in the form of a single quiet choice made by someone who has already seen exactly what that choice will cost them, and who has decided, in full knowledge of the price, that it is still the right thing to do. That is the courage of Prometheus. And the world we live in, every warm and illuminated corner of it, is the world that courage built. There is a particular quality to the anger of kings. It is not the hot, immediate fury of a soldier in battle, or the sharp grief rage of someone who has just been betrayed by a friend. It is colder than that, and more deliberate, and in many ways far more frightening, because it has time on its side. A king's anger does not need to be expressed immediately. It can wait, it can think, it can construct its response with the same careful architecture that builds a prison brick by brick, until the thing it wants to contain has no possible direction left to move. Zeus was the king of all kings, and when he looked down from Olympus and saw the fires burning, those small, scattered, defiant points of warmth multiplying across the human world, like seeds taking root after rain, his anger was exactly that kind. Cold, architectural, patient, with the patience of someone who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply choosing the right shape for it. He had been defied before. The gods were not strangers to rebellion. The entire order of Olympus had been built on a defiance of its own. Zeus himself had overthrown his father Kronos, had led a revolution against the Titans, had rewritten the rules of the cosmos to his own specification. He understood, better than most, what it felt like to be the one who said no to the established order and meant it. Perhaps that is precisely why the transgression of Prometheus cut as deeply as it did. Zeus recognized the shape of it. He knew what it was to look at the rules as they existed and decide, with full knowledge of the consequences, that they needed to be broken. He could not allow it to stand, not because the fire itself was irreplaceable. Olympus still burned, would always burn, and no hollow reed could diminish that eternal source, but because the act, if left unanswered, would mean something. It would mean that the line between human and divine could be crossed by anyone willing to cross it. It would mean that the order Zeus had fought, a 10-year war to establish, was merely a suggestion. It would mean that Prometheus, a titan who had been shown mercy, who had been trusted, who had been welcomed into the world of the victorious gods as an equal, could decide unilaterally to reshape the cosmos according to his own judgment, and face no consequence for it. That could not stand. And so Zeus turned the full weight of his architectural fury toward the question of what the consequence would be. The punishment he devised was not arrived at carelessly. This is important to understand, because it is tempting to read the chaining of Prometheus as a simple act of divine temper. The king lashing out, the powerful crushing the defiant. But it was not that. It was something more considered, and in its own terrible way more sophisticated than mere cruelty. Zeus was not interested in killing Prometheus. Death would have been too simple, too clean, too final. Death would have made Prometheus a martyr in a single moment, and then been done with him forever. What Zeus wanted was not an ending. What Zeus wanted was a demonstration. One that would last as long as the cosmos itself, visible to gods and humans alike, a monument to the cost of defiance that could never be ignored or forgotten. He sent Hephaestus, the divine smith, the master of fire and metal. And here the irony is exquisite, almost certainly intentional, to chain Prometheus to a mountain. Not just any mountain, the Caucasus Range, that vast and remote spine of rock running between the Black Sea and the Caspian, at the very edge of the known world, far from humanity, far from Olympus, far from any witness who might offer comfort or company. The chains were not ordinary iron. They were divine bonds, forged with the full craft of the god of the forge himself, designed to hold something that was not human and could not be broken by anything less than the will of Zeus. Prometheus was spread against the rock face, his arms extended, his body exposed to the full weather of that high and desolate place, unable to move, unable to cover himself, unable to do anything at all, except endure what was coming. Hephaestus himself, in the oldest tellings, went reluctantly. Aeschylus, whose great tragedy Prometheus bound is our most vivid surviving account of this moment, gives us a Hephaestus who speaks with genuine anguish as he drives the chains into the rock. He does not want to do this. He tells Prometheus so. He acknowledges that the Titan has done nothing that deserved this specific, elaborate, intimate suffering. But the will of Zeus is the will of Zeus. And even the divine smith who bends metal to his purpose every day cannot bend the command of the king of the gods. He drives the stakes. He fastens the chains. He leaves. And then every day, as the sun rose over those remote peaks, and this is the centerpiece of the punishment, the piece that transforms it from cruelty into something almost mythologically sublime. An eagle descended. In some versions it is described simply as a great eagle, vast and purposeful, its shadow falling over the chained Titan like a slow eclipse. In other versions it is explicitly identified as the eagle of Zeus himself, his personal symbol, the creature most associated with his divine authority, which makes the whole thing a kind of signature, a daily reminder of exactly who had arranged this and why. The eagle landed on Prometheus, and it ate his liver. The liver in ancient Greek understanding was not simply an organ. It was believed to be the seat of life itself, the source of blood, the center of vitality, in a way that the heart even was not. To have the liver consumed was not simply painful. It was to be unmade, daily, at the very core of your living self. And because Prometheus was immortal, because he was a Titan and could not die from this or from anything, his liver regenerated each night, grew back whole in the darkness, restored by the same divine nature that made him indestructible, so that when the sun rose again the eagle could return, and the consumption could begin again from the beginning, day after day, year after year, century after century. There are forms of suffering that are made worse by their repetition, and forms that are made worse by their infinity, and this punishment managed to be both simultaneously. The pain itself was not abstract or occasional or something that could be psychologically prepared for and then moved past. It was immediate and recurring, and it had no end date. Prometheus could not even hold on to the thought that it would one day be over, because it was specifically designed never to be over. Zeus had not sentenced him to a period of punishment. He had sentenced him to eternity, to a situation in which each day was a complete horror, and the only thing worse than today was the knowledge that tomorrow was identical, and the day after that, and every day stretching forward until the cosmos itself chose to end. And yet, and this is the thing about Prometheus that the myth never lets go of, he did not break. Aeschylus shows us a Titan in chains who remains, against all reason and all pressure, entirely himself. Hermes is sent to Prometheus on behalf of Zeus, carrying an offer: reveal the secret you carry, the prophecy about how Zeus's reign will one day be threatened, the knowledge only Prometheus possesses, and your suffering ends. The chains come off. The eagle is called away. Everything stops. All Zeus wants is the information. All Prometheus has to do is give it. Prometheus refuses, not quietly, not with exhausted resignation, but with a kind of blazing, almost contemptuous clarity. He tells Hermes to carry his refusal back to Zeus, and to be precise about it. He will not trade his knowledge for his comfort. He will not purchase his own relief at the cost of his integrity. He understands, with his gift of foresight, exactly how long this will continue, and he chooses it anyway. Chooses the rock and the eagle and the daily unmaking over the one act that would end it, but would require him to become something other than what he is. This is where the punishment overreaches itself, in the way that all punishment built on the assumption of breaking someone eventually overreaches. Zeus had designed something inescapable. He had not designed something that could reach inside Prometheus and change the nature of what was in there. The chains held the body. They could not hold the will. The eagle consumed the liver. It could not consume the conviction. Every morning it came back, and every morning Prometheus was still there, still himself, still unbroken, still in possession of the one thing Zeus actually wanted, and still, with perfect and infuriating calm, refusing to give it. The mountain held him, but it could not diminish him. And across the world, far from those remote and wind-scraped peaks, the fires he had carried down from Olympus kept burning. In every hearth and every forge and every torch held aloft in the dark, the thing he had given was still alive, still warm, still doing exactly what he had foreseen it doing, building the world he had imagined for the people he had loved enough to suffer for. Zeus had answered a theft with eternity, but eternity, it turned out, was not the same thing as victory. There is something that powerful men have always understood, instinctively and without being taught it, about the nature of punishment. Hurting the person who defied you is satisfying, in the cold and architectural way that Zeus's anger was always satisfying. But it is not, by itself, complete, because the person who defied you did it for someone. They did it out of love, or loyalty, or principle. And all three of those things have an object, a recipient, a world they were trying to protect or improve or illuminate. And if you want your punishment to carry its full weight, if you want it to reach into every corner of what the defiant one valued and leave a mark there too, then you do not stop at the defiant one, you go after what they loved. Zeus understood this with the precision of someone who had been thinking about power for a very long time. Prometheus had stolen fire for humanity. Prometheus was now chained to a mountain, suffering in the most elaborately designed way the king of the gods could conceive. But humanity itself, those fragile, extraordinary, newly illuminated creatures, living in their warm new world with their forges and their hearths and their torches burning through the dark, humanity had not yet been made to feel the cost of what had been done on their behalf. They had received the gift. They had not yet received the bill. Zeus was going to send them the bill. The instrument of that second punishment was, like everything Zeus constructed, in his most deliberate moods, a work of extraordinary craft and layered meaning. It was not a weapon, exactly. It was not a plague or a flood or a fire sent in the opposite direction to cancel the one that had been stolen. It was something stranger, and in the long view of mythology and culture, something far more consequential. It was a woman, and her name was Pandora. The creation of Pandora is one of the most debated and most misunderstood episodes in all of Greek mythology, carrying centuries of interpretive baggage that has obscured the original story beneath layers of moralizing and misreading. So let us clear some of that away and look at what the oldest sources actually tell us. Hesiod, our primary witness, describes the creation of Pandora in two separate works, the Theogony and the Works and Days, and in both, the framing is unambiguous. Pandora was not an innocent victim of divine caprice. She was, from the very first moment of her conception, a punishment. Zeus ordered Hephaestus to mix earth and water and shape from them the form of a woman, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, designed with the specific intention of being sent into the world of men as a gift that was not a gift, a grace that concealed a wound. Every god on Olympus contributed something to her making. Athena clothed her and taught her weaving. Aphrodite poured beauty over her like light. The Graces adorned her with gold necklaces. The seasons crowned her with flowers. Hermes, the messenger god, reached inside her and placed there something that none of the other gifts could soften or contain. A deceitful nature, shifting words, and a character designed to be unreadable. Her very name encodes the paradox. Pandora, all gifted, or in some readings, all giving, a creature assembled from the contributions of the entire divine order. Each gift, a surface layer over a deeper intention, beautiful in the way that only a perfectly constructed trap can be beautiful, which is to say, completely, and without any visible flaw. She was sent first to Prometheus, and here the myth deepens into something almost unbearably poignant, because Prometheus, whose name means hindsight, the opposite of his brother's gift, had been warned. Prometheus, even from his chains, even across the distance of rock and sky and suffering, had managed to send a message to his brother: do not accept any gift from Zeus. Whatever comes down from Olympus with a smile attached to it, turn it away. Trust nothing that arrives as generosity from a god who has reason to be angry. Prometheus, true to his name, forgot, or chose not to remember. He looked at Pandora, and what Prometheus's foresight had seen as a danger, his hindsight processed as a gift, and he accepted her, took her as his wife, brought her into his home and into his life, and into the world of men, and in doing so, opened the door through which everything that followed would eventually walk. The vessel she carried with her, described in the earliest texts as a large storage jar, a pithos, though the Renaissance mistranslation of it as a box has so thoroughly entered the cultural bloodstream that correcting it feels almost futile, had been sealed. Inside it, Zeus had placed everything he wished to send into the human world, now that the protected age of innocence was over. Not merely evil in the simple sense. The contents were more specific and more terrible than that. Disease, old age, madness, vice, grief, envy, spite. Every form of suffering that human beings have named and unnamed in the centuries since. Every ache that settles into a body over time. Every fear that arrives in the small hours of the night and refuses to leave. Every loss that cannot be prepared for. Every disappointment that carves something permanent out of who you were before it arrived. Pandora opened it. The debates about why she opened it have never fully resolved, and perhaps they are not supposed to. Hesiod describes curiosity as the operative force, and there is something in that which feels deliberately and uncomfortably human. The same quality that drives us toward knowledge. The same restless intelligence that reaches for understanding even when understanding comes at a cost. Turned here toward a sealed vessel in a quiet room. She could not leave it alone. She looked. She opened it. And everything inside rushed out into the world at once, dispersing like smoke before she could force the lid back down. Everything, that is, except one thing. At the very bottom of the jar, when all the rest had escaped and the air had settled, one thing remained. Elpis. Hope. The interpretation of this single remaining element has generated more philosophical argument than almost any other detail in Greek mythology, and it deserves more than a passing mention because it is not as straightforward as it first appears. Why was hope kept inside the jar? If the jar contained evils, is hope then an evil? A deception that sustains human beings through their suffering by promising relief that may never arrive? Or is it the one mercy that Zeus permitted, the counterweight he placed at the bottom to keep humanity from being entirely crushed by everything else that had just been released? Is hope our salvation, or is it our most sophisticated torment? The Greeks did not resolve this question. They held it open, deliberately. The way a good teacher holds open the question that has no single answer but whose contemplation changes the person who sits with it long enough. What they agreed on was this: suffering had entered the world as a direct consequence of the fire being given, and the fire had been given as an act of love. And so love and suffering were now braided together in human experience in a way that could not be separated. You could not have one without the other. The warmth of the hearth and the grief of loss were henceforth companions, inseparable, two sides of the same gift that Prometheus had carried down the mountain in his hollow reed. And where was Prometheus during all of this? Still on the mountain, still in the chains. His foresight would have shown him what was coming for his brother, for humanity, for the world he had tried to protect. He would have seen Pandora's creation, her journey, the opening of the jar, the dispersal of suffering into the human world. He had warned Prometheus, and Prometheus had not listened, and now the warning was irrelevant because the thing it had warned against had already happened. This is perhaps the cruelest refinement of Zeus's punishment, one that is easy to miss beneath the more dramatic imagery of the eagle and the chains. Prometheus had suffered for his love of humanity, and then he had been made to watch, helpless and immobilized, as that same humanity, the people he had illuminated, the creatures he had gifted with fire and reason and the tools of civilization, were made to pay the price alongside him. His suffering and theirs were linked. What he had done for them had been made by Zeus's design, the very mechanism by which their suffering was justified and delivered. Every headache, every fever, every grief that has ever moved through a human life since then carries within it the faint structural shape of that arrangement. You were given fire. Here is what fire costs. The gift and the wound arrived together, sealed in the same vessel, indistinguishable from each other until the lid came off. Prometheus, on his mountain, knew all of this. He had known it before any of it happened. He had walked toward it with open eyes and a hollow reed sheltering a single flame against the wind. He still believed it was worth it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Time moves differently for an immortal. This is not a poetic observation. It is a structural one. And it matters enormously when you are trying to understand what the chaining of Prometheus actually meant, not in the abstract language of myth, but in the lived, embodied, daily reality of what it was to be him. For a human being, even the most severe suffering carries within it the silent mercy of an endpoint. The body wears out. The years accumulate, and then stop accumulating. Even in the worst circumstances imaginable, a human prisoner can hold on to the knowledge, however distant and uncertain, that this will one day be over. That time itself is moving in a direction, and that direction eventually leads out of whatever darkness currently surrounds them. The horizon exists. It may be very far away, but it is there. Prometheus had no horizon. That was the specific, deliberate genius of the punishment Zeus had constructed, and it is worth sitting with that fact until it becomes real rather than merely conceptual. Not years on the mountain, not decades, not centuries, those centuries certainly passed. Eternity, a word so large that the human mind instinctively bounces off its surface rather than entering it, because entering it fully would be unbearable. The chains were not a sentence with a release date. They were the new permanent condition of his existence, as fixed and unalterable as the rock they were driven into, as endless as the sky. The eagle crossed each morning on its way to him, and each morning it came. This is the detail that the myth repeats, and that repetition is itself the point, not occasionally, not unpredictably, which might at least have introduced into the suffering some element of uncertainty, some days of reprieve, to contrast against the days of pain. Every morning, with the absolute reliability of the sun rising, and in fact precisely synchronized with the sun rising, the light and the eagle arriving together, as if the universe itself had been set up as an instrument of his punishment. It came, and every night his body restored itself, not as mercy but as mechanism, rebuilding the very thing that would be destroyed again in a matter of hours, so that the destruction could begin again from the beginning, fresh and total and undiminished by familiarity. Consider what that repetition does to a mind. Human psychology understands something about this, dimly and inadequately given that no human has ever truly faced it. There is a form of torment that psychologists recognize as distinct from and in certain ways worse than acute suffering. And that is the suffering that has become routine, the pain that arrives on a schedule, the wound that is not allowed to scar because it is reopened before the healing can complete itself. It removes the one cognitive tool that allows a conscious being to endure hardship, which is the construction of a narrative around it. Humans survive terrible things by telling themselves a story about those terrible things, a story with a shape, a progression, a movement towards something. Prometheus was denied that story. There was no progression. There was only the eternal present tense of the eagle and the chains, day after identical day, with his foresight showing him not a way out, but simply more of the same extending forward without limit. And yet he endured. Not merely survived, endured, which is a different and far more active thing. Survival can be passive, a matter of simply not dying when dying is not an option. Endurance is a choice made continuously, in every moment, against the gravitational pull of whatever would break you if you let it. Prometheus chose, every morning when the shadow of the eagle fell across him, not to be broken. Chose it not once, heroically, in a single dramatic moment of resolution, but thousands of times, millions of times, each repetition of the choice as complete and deliberate as the first. The gods noticed. They could hardly avoid noticing. Olympus was not so far away that the chained titan on the Caucasus was invisible to divine awareness, and his refusal to break was not a quiet or private thing. It announced itself in his posture, in his voice when Hermes came to negotiate, in the quality of his silence when no one came at all. Aeschylus understood this, and it is why his Prometheus bound gives us a titan who is not diminished by his chains, but somehow enlarged by them, whose confinement, paradoxically, makes him the most free being in the drama, because he is the only one acting entirely according to his own nature, without compromise, without calculation about consequences, without the self-protective adjustments that everyone else, gods and humans alike, is constantly making in relation to power. Hermes came more than once. This is implied in the ancient sources, even where it is not stated explicitly. The offer that Zeus extended through his messenger was too important. The secret Prometheus held too valuable for a single failed negotiation to be the end of it. And the secret itself deserves careful attention, because it was not merely leverage. It was, in the architecture of the myth, the reason Zeus could not simply destroy Prometheus and be done with him. Prometheus knew something. Specifically, he knew the identity of the woman whose son would one day overthrow his father. A prophecy that mirrored almost exactly the pattern by which Zeus himself had overthrown Kronos, who had in turn overthrown Uranos. The cosmos had a pattern. Power was succeeded by power, father toppled by son, in a cycle that seemed to be written into the structure of things. And the only way to break that cycle, to secure the reign of Zeus against the same fate that had claimed every king before him, was to know which woman carried that danger in her bloodline and to avoid her. Prometheus knew. He had seen it with the same foresight that had shown him the outcome of the Titanomachy, the same clarity of future vision that had guided every important decision of his existence. And he would not tell. Not because telling was physically impossible, not because the words were beyond him or the information too complex to communicate. He would not tell because telling would mean trading the only thing he had left, his integrity, his refusal to serve the power that had unjustly broken him. for the relief of his own suffering. It would mean that Zeus's punishment had worked, that the chains had done what chains are designed to do, which is to alter the behavior and the will of the thing they hold. Prometheus looked at that bargain with clear eyes every time Hermes laid it out, and every time he made the same calculation and arrived at the same answer. The suffering was real. The price of maintaining his position was real, and the position was worth the price. There is a philosophical tradition, much later than the Greeks, but growing directly from seeds they planted, that speaks about the difference between what happens to you and what you do with what happens to you. The Stoics would eventually build an entire system of thought around the idea that the one freedom no external force can take from you is the freedom to determine your own response to your circumstances. Prometheus is not a Stoic. He predates the school by centuries and operates in a register that is far more elemental and mythic than philosophical. But something of that bedrock idea lives in him, in its oldest and most primal form. Zeus controlled the mountain, the chains, the eagle, the daily ritual of destruction and renewal. He controlled everything about the external conditions of Prometheus's existence, what he could not control, and what the myth makes clear he was never able to control, no matter how long the punishment continued, was what Prometheus thought about those conditions, what he valued, what he refused to surrender in exchange for their improvement. The other gods, and this matters, mostly kept their distance. This was not, in Olympus, a case where divine opinion was unanimous and only Prometheus disagreed. The chorus of sea nymphs in Aeschylus's telling comes to visit him in his chains, and they come not to mock but to mourn, bringing with them a current of sympathy that suggests the discomfort of those who witness a punishment they know to be excessive, but feel powerless to challenge. Even Hephaestus, driving the stakes into the rock at the beginning, could not fully separate himself from the knowledge that what he was doing was wrong, even as he did it. The divine order was not a perfectly comfortable place to live after the chaining of Prometheus. His suffering was a wound in the fabric of things that everyone could feel, a low and constant vibration of injustice that the official narrative of divine authority could not quite silence. Meanwhile, below, humanity was doing what humanity does: building, burning, failing and rebuilding, using the fire, growing, slowly and with tremendous difficulty and loss, into something that the creatures shivering in the pre-fire darkness could not have imagined. The civilization that fire made possible was not clean or beautiful or free of suffering. Pandora had seen to that, and the jar had long since been opened. But it was alive, and it was expanding, and it carried within it the specific signature of what Prometheus had done. The insistence that human beings deserved more than they had been given, that the line between their condition and something better was a line worth crossing regardless of what crossing it cost. Every city built by torchlight, every poem written by candlelight, every surgery performed under a lamp, every winter survived beside a hearth, every idea that was born in the warmth of a room that would otherwise have been cold and dark, all of it traces back, through an unbroken chain of fire passed from hand to hand across the centuries, to a titan on a mountain who had seen the future and walked toward it anyway. He was still up there, in the chains, in the cold, with the eagle coming in the morning. But the fire was burning. That part at least had worked exactly as he knew it would. Every story that is told long enough eventually arrives at a moment that feels, in retrospect, inevitable. Not because it was predetermined in some mechanical sense, not because the characters within it had no choices, but because the internal logic of the story, the values it has been quietly accumulating, the tensions it has been carefully building, the questions it has been holding open since the very first line, finally reaches the only resolution that is equal to everything that came before it. The story has been asking a question. The ending is the answer, and when it arrives, You recognize it not with surprise, but with something closer to the feeling of a key turning in a lock that has been waiting, perhaps for a very long time, for exactly that key. The liberation of Prometheus is that moment, but to understand it fully, to feel its weight rather than simply observe its mechanics, we need to understand who it is that finally comes up the mountain, because the identity of the liberator is not incidental to the myth. It is load-bearing. It carries meaning that would collapse if you substituted any other figure in the role. The hero who climbs to the Caucasus, who draws his bow against the eagle and breaks the chains of the most ancient and enduring captivity in the history of the Greek cosmos, is Heracles. And Heracles is not simply a strong man with a bow. He is, in the symbolic architecture of Greek mythology, something far more specific and far more resonant than that. He is the greatest of the human heroes, the son of Zeus, yes, but raised as a mortal, living as a mortal, suffering as a mortal, dying eventually as a mortal before his apotheosis raises him to Olympus. He is the bridge between the human and the divine in the most literal possible sense, carrying both natures within him simultaneously, never fully at home in either world, defined precisely by the tension between what he was born as and what he was capable of. And this is the son who frees the Titan who gave humanity fire, the human hero, the child of the very god who ordered the chains, who climbs the mountain and undoes his father's most elaborate act of punishment. The layers of meaning in that arrangement are almost architectural in their density. Consider what it says about the relationship between Zeus and his creation. The fire Prometheus stole allowed human civilization to develop. That civilization, over its long and painful centuries of growth, produced heroes. Those heroes, shaped by suffering, tested by impossibility, defined by what they were willing to do when no one else would do it, eventually produced Heracles. And Heracles, the finest flowering of everything human civilization at its most extraordinary could become, climbed the mountain and freed the Titan who had made all of it possible. The gift came back around. What Prometheus had given to humanity, humanity, in its most elevated form, returned to Prometheus. Zeus permitted it. This is the detail that requires the most careful attention, because it is easy to read the liberation as Zeus finally being overcome, finally defeated, his punishment dismantled against his will by a son he could not control. But that is not quite what the myth tells us. By the time Heracles makes his journey to the Caucasus, something has shifted in the divine calculus. The reasons for that shift involve the secret Prometheus carried, the prophecy about the son who would overthrow his father, and the particular way in which that secret was eventually resolved. The woman at the center of the prophecy was the sea nymph Thetis, a figure of extraordinary beauty whom both Zeus and Poseidon had desired. Prometheus knew, and had always known, that the son of Thetis was fated to surpass his father in greatness. If Zeus had taken Thetis as his lover, and she had borne him a son, that son would have become the instrument of Zeus's overthrow. The pattern repeating itself as it had repeated through Uranus and Kronos, the wheel of divine succession turning once more. The information Prometheus held was not merely interesting, it was the most consequential piece of knowledge in the cosmos, the one fact that stood between Zeus and the security of his eternal reign. The secret came out, eventually, through channels the myth handles with characteristic indirection, through Themis, goddess of divine law, or through Prometheus himself in a moment of negotiation whose precise details vary across sources. But the outcome is clear. Zeus, learning the identity of the dangerous woman, arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal instead. That mortal was Peleus. Their son was Achilles, the greatest of human warriors, surpassing his mortal father as the prophecy had foretold, but not an existential threat to Olympus because his father had been human rather than divine. The prophecy was fulfilled and diffused simultaneously. The wheel that had turned against every divine king before Zeus was, through this single act of forewarned avoidance, finally broken. And Prometheus, who had carried that secret through every mourning of the eagle, through every refusal delivered to Hermes, through every year on the mountain, Prometheus had held it until its resolution no longer required his silence. The information had served its purpose, or had been rendered unnecessary, or had been released as part of some negotiation between his suffering and Zeus's need. The ancient sources are not perfectly clear on the exact mechanism, and perhaps that is appropriate. What is clear is that with the secret no longer providing Zeus a reason to need Prometheus broken, and with his son Heracles approaching the mountain on a journey that was part of the great cycle of heroic labor, Zeus chose not to intervene, chose, perhaps, to let something end that had gone on long enough. Heracles arrived at the Caucasus in the course of his famous labors, or in some versions after them, as a separate journey undertaken out of something more personal than duty. He had heard the story. Every Greek had heard the story, and Heracles, who understood suffering in the intimate and embodied way that only someone who has carried the weight of impossible tasks across an impossible life can understand it, came not as an instrument of divine policy, but as something closer to a friend, or at least as someone who recognized in the Titan situation something that demanded a response from anyone capable of providing one. He came up through the high passes of the Caucasus, through the cold and the wind, to where the rock face held its captive, and the chains had long since become as familiar to Prometheus as his own skin. What that encounter looked like, what words passed between the greatest of human heroes and the oldest of the Titan benefactors. The myth does not fully tell us, and the restraint feels right. Some meetings are too large for complete description. Some silences carry more than any available language. What we know is what Heracles did. He strung his bow, the great bow given to him by Apollo, which had felled monsters and men and creatures that existed at the very edge of the possible, and he waited. And when the eagle came, as it came every morning crossing the sky with the implacable certainty of long habit, Heracles drew and released. The eagle fell. In the sudden quiet that followed, the absence of wings, the absence of shadow, the absence of the thing that had been arriving every morning for longer than most human civilizations had existed, Prometheus remained against the rock, still chained. The eagle was gone, but the bonds were not, and this is the moment the myth handles with a precision that matters. Heracles broke the chains. Physically, with the strength that was the most obvious of his many extraordinary qualities, he broke what Hephaestus had forged and Zeus had ordered, and the Titan who had been held against that rock for an eternity of mornings came free. What does freedom feel like after a captivity without measure? The myth does not tell us, and again, the silence seems deliberate. There are experiences that resist language not because they are empty, but because they are too full. Because the gap between the words available and the reality they are being asked to describe is simply too wide to bridge. Prometheus had been a being of immense motion, of foresight that ranged across the entire arc of time, of creative intelligence that had shaped the human world and counseled gods and crossed the line between the divine and the mortal for love. All of that had been compressed for an unimaginable span of time into the dimensions of a chained body on a mountainside. And now, the compression was over. One small concession remained, a remnant of the punishment that Zeus required to persist so that the technical terms of his decree could be considered honored. Prometheus was made to wear, for the rest of his existence, a ring set with a fragment of the Caucasus rock, so that in the symbolic language of divine law, he could be said to still be bound to the mountain, still carrying the terms of his sentence even in his freedom. The Greeks were precise about these things. The forms of divine obligation and their technical fulfillment mattered enormously, and a completely unconditional release would have been, in the architecture of cosmic law, a different thing than the resolution that had actually occurred. But the ring was not the chains, and Prometheus wore it, presumably, the way anyone wears the small remaining evidence of a long ordeal, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what had been endured, of what had been refused, of the long, specific, detailed cost of doing the thing he had decided was right, and the fact that he had paid it in full without once wishing he had chosen differently. He stepped away from the mountain. The rock behind him held only the marks where the chains had been, and the silence where the eagle no longer came, and the particular quality of emptiness that belongs to places where something enormous has finally concluded. Below, in every direction, the fires were still burning. The cities, the forges, the lamps and the hearths and the torches, the whole warm, complicated suffering, building, reaching, dreaming civilization that a hollow reed had carried down from Olympus in an act of love so complete it had survived an eternity of punishment without diminishing by a single degree. He had given them fire. They had sent him Heracles. The exchange, across all those centuries of chains and eagles and cold Caucasian mornings, had finally completed itself. And the story, this particular, irreplaceable story about what it costs to love something enough to suffer for it, had arrived at the only ending that was ever equal to its beginning. The flame endures. It always has. That, perhaps, is the whole point.